I didn't love Final Fantasy VII Remake. In fact, I'll take it a step further. I think Final Fantasy VII Remake was a bad game. Not because the combat system is bad. I actually think the combat in Remake is up there with one of the better combat systems you'd find in Japanese action RPGs. Not quite Neo 2 Stranger of Paradise tier, but when compared to a lot of the more popular ones, like especially people love Kingdom Hearts for whatever reason, I think Remake blows Kingdom Hearts out of the water in terms of combat. But the combat system was not the issue with Remake, it was the RPG part. So pacing, progression, storytelling, all of those things held the game back and made it not enjoyable to replay. It's really just a prologue. The Midgar section in Final Fantasy VII was just a taste of things to come for the rest of the game. It was the setup. If you take an introduction and you try to make it a full game, of course you're not going to accomplish that without introducing a ton of padding. So how do you stretch out a 3-hour prologue into a 30-hour game? Well, you have the player go through the sewer dungeon twice, you have Shinra headquarters be a 7 or 8 hour long cutscene and boss and dungeon gauntlet, you have force walking tucked into every single little nook and cranny, you cannot escape it. I've never seen force walking done to such an egregious extent before. And so I wasn't really interested in playing the sequel, Rebirth, because I figured same team, same staff, it's gonna be more of the same. And does Rebirth fix these issues from Remake? No, it doesn't. It has the same issues that Remake has. It's still filled to the brim with forced walking, it's got a ton of padding, it's got a ton of cutscenes that interrupt the pacing, there's super long dungeons. The final stretch of this game, the last 2 chapters, is like 7 hours long. You're ready for it to end. You've got like half a game's worth of content there. This game takes all of the mistakes from Remake, and it learns nothing. Of course, having said that, this is the best Final Fantasy I've played since 12. It's the most fun I've had with the series in about 18 years. I couldn't believe it. I seriously couldn't believe it. I spent about 75 hours playing this game, and the kicker is, this is a better action game than Final Fantasy XVI. I know Final Fantasy XVI was advertised as the first true action RPG of the series. They got one of the battle programmers from Capcom that worked on Devil May Cry. Let me just be honest here, okay? Final Fantasy XVI is a competent action game, but it is a poor role-playing game. And the thing is, Final Fantasy XVI is not a character action game. It's an action RPG. You've got the action, but you're missing half of that, the RPG part. And I don't want to go into this too much because I don't feel like replaying a huge chunk of Final Fantasy XVI to get footage because it's honestly just not that fun to play. But here's the thing, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth marries action with RPG and succeeds. In fact, as far as action RPGs go, I think this is one of the best that I've played. Seriously, in terms of gameplay, not just combat, but every aspect of gameplay. Most aspects, I should say. This is up there for sure. This is I never thought there'd come a day where I would praise a Square Enix game, but seriously, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as an action RPG, it kicks ass. 16, it wants to be a character action game, but the developers forgot along the way that this needed to be an RPG, so they forgot about things like elemental affinities, party members in the game. They're like an afterthought, you can't control them. Maybe you could forgive the lack of RPG elements in 16 if the character action gameplay was good, but the issue there is that there wasn't enough depth that you would find in games like Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry. People seem to think that combos are what make these character action games good, but the reality is that enemy design is what makes them good, and every enemy in Final Fantasy XVI is fought basically the same way. And when you have just one playable character and just one weapon type, you'd better make 200% sure that the enemy designs and the encounters steal the show, and that just isn't the case with Final Fantasy XVI. And also, the game is way too damn easy. You don't unlock the harder difficulty, the Final Fantasy mode, until New Game Plus, and they work similarly in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. You don't unlock hard mode until you beat the game, but I think both Remake and Rebirth offer a more consistent challenge on that base playthrough than 16. 16, I don't think I died once. It was a total cakewalk. And New Game Plus's Final Fantasy mode is even easier. There's like an arcade mode where you have an even more difficult challenge by playing through the dungeons on an even harder difficulty, but at that point, you've already played through these dungeons twice, and even then, it never becomes great. The iframes that you have on your dodge attacks in 16 are just so absurdly wide, and it really shows that the Final Fantasy XIV team worked on that game, because the abilities are cooldown dependent. Cooldowns have no place in an action game. I don't think cooldowns have any place in any game, period. I think it's just ridiculous to expect the player to wait before they can fire off their cool abilities. You should earn the ability to fire off those cool attacks, which VII Remake and Rebirth do with the ATB system. It rewards you for stringing together basic attacks and doing perfect guards by giving you meter that you can use to use the most powerful abilities. That's the way to do it, not by forcing the player to wait 30 seconds before they can fire off Bahamut's Mega Flare attack. But like, what is that? You're relying on such an anemic moveset for your sword. You only have one weapon type in 16, and you just need to rely on that until your cooldowns come online. It's such a boring system. You don't have a whole lot of upkeep on using these flashy attacks. And not only that, for a character action game, they have most of the big boss fights be scripted encounters that you fight in the same way every time. Almost like they're cinematic cutscenes with QuickTime events. Like, that's horrible. That has no place in an action game. And I know I said Rebirth doesn't fix the same issues that Remake had, and it doesn't. It has all of those same issues persistent here. But Rebirth picks up the slack by being a fun game to play. There's so much variety here, so much content. It's baffling. I don't think most people going into this game are gonna realize just how daunting this experience is in terms of how much there is to do if you want to experience everything there is to experience in this game. You need 2 playthroughs at a minimum to get the most out of it. I can't even say most RPGs are worth a single playthrough, let alone 2. This game absolutely deserves 2 playthroughs. And what really caught me off guard was how lighthearted the tone of this game is.
More toys.
And another thing that really got me about this game is that you can feel the passion that went into it. This doesn't feel like a cash grab. This doesn't feel like a lazy shoe-in entry, like we need to make another Final Fantasy game, cobble some stuff together and push it out the door. No, this is a huge game. This makes Remake feel even worse than it already felt. It makes it feel like a glorified tech demo. This game, with how much content there is in terms of story, in terms of side quests, mini-games are just insane. I have to cover these mini-games because I love Mario Party, and this game is basically single-player Mario Party. The soundtrack is like over 200 songs. I think I saw it was like close to 250 songs. That is unbelievable. I seriously cannot believe just how much effort went into this game. This is a huge game, and so much of it is of a consistently high quality that I'm not going to go on about Nojima anymore because I don't hate the guy on a personal level, and I actually think he does a somewhat decent job with Rebirth in terms of character development and dialogue, but man, the main plot in this game is so bad. It's not unbelievable because Remake's plot was horrible, and this game is equally as bad, if not worse. In fact, the ending to Rebirth may very well be the single worst ending to any game I've ever seen and will ever see. That's not an exaggeration. This is going to go down in history as one of the worst endings to any game ever. And keep in mind, this series has Final Fantasy XIII 2, which ended with a to be continued screen at the end of the game. I thought that you could not sink lower than that. I would kill to have this game end with a to be continued cliffhanger. I'm going to not talk that much about the story. I'm going to at least resist the urge to talk too much about the story. I don't want to go on at length about it because there's no point. There's really no point. I think the first half of this game follows along very closely with the original. Once you reach the second half, the back half of this game, and the whispers start showing up, just forget it. It's not worth your time. It's seriously not worth the time trying to analyze what the hell happens in this game, although it's not like it's confusing. The problem with this game's story, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but just real quick, The problem with this game's story isn't that it's confusing, it's that it's convoluted just for the sake of being complex. It's not trying to be an interesting story, it's trying to be a confusing one, but it's not really that confusing, it's just annoying. You have a really well-paced and well-structured story in the original game, and all you've done is you've taken a crayon and you've marked it up with all this red ink. And for what? What have you done? Because the core storyline here is the same. You've just you've duct taped all this bullshit onto it, and there's nothing to be gained from it. The same story is here. Why do you have to, muddy it, put all this junk on top? What's the point? Are you trying to make this... If you are a fan, you know what? Forget being a fan. If you are playing Rebirth, and you haven't played Final Fantasy VII, you are not going to know what in the hell is going on in this game. This is not a game that is friendly to newcomers. This game, honest to God, is not just a sequel to Remake. This whole trilogy of this Remake saga is in totality a sequel to Final Fantasy VII. If you didn't play Final Fantasy VII, the PlayStation 1 original version, you really have no business playing this game if you care about the story, because you are going to get snowed by all of this absurd, over-complex... And this is the problem I had with Kingdom Hearts. Kingdom Hearts should have been a series about some Disney bad guys trying to destroy the world, and you play as some Final Fantasy-esque character rounding up the Disney good guys to stop them. That's all it should have been, and for 90% of the very first Kingdom Hearts game, that's what it was. Up until you kill Maleficent. I don't even know if you kill her. It's been like 20-something years since I played that game. But up until you beat Maleficent, it's a pretty straightforward storyline. All the junk that happens afterwards that was introduced in Chain of Memories and Birth by Sleep, all of this extra Nomura Final Fantasy garbage, completely overshadows the Disney aspect. And it got to a point where, why are there even Disney worlds and Disney characters in Kingdom Hearts 3? The Disney part has nothing to do with anything in the overarching story. It is completely irrelevant. You go to Disney worlds and you relive these Disney movies, and the characters even verbally express, why the hell are we here? What are we doing? The whole game is framed with this amnesia plotline because the developers, the story writer, I don't know who wrote that story, it was a disaster. Whoever wrote the story didn't have a compelling reason to revisit these Disney worlds, and so basically they sent Sora on a vacation, go tour these Disney worlds, go check out all these characters and see what they're doing, have fun, come back here at the end, and we'll get the story on the move. We'll get the ball rolling again. Like, what is the point of taking Disney and making it this complicated mess? You're wasting the Disney part of it. That is exactly the same thing that is happening with Rebirth. You are making it overcomplicated for no reason. You haven't, and it's the same writer. Nojima wrote the original story as well. I don't think he came up with a story concept. I think that was Sakaguchi, but he wrote the scenario for the original Final Fantasy VII. I'm sure someone, probably Sakaguchi, vetoed a lot of his stupid ideas, which is why that game was paced fairly well. But without anyone to keep the shackle on this guy, he's gone full unleashed, terrorizing mode, and has made this utter disaster, complicated nonsense. It's not needed. Just dial back the insanity and retell the original storyline. If you had some stuff that was cut out, you want to put it back in, fine. But by having like this multi-dimensional, interdimensional characters are moving in and out of one dimension and the other, what's happening in one may or may not impact another, and it is so... The last 2 hours of this game, I really have no words for it. I'm just gonna... let's just move on to the combat, because honestly, the story is really not worth talking about. It truly isn't. So the combat in Remake was really good, but it was missing that special something. It was a little bit too simple, but on a technical level, the characters were fun to play as. But Remake's sort of Achilles heel was that there really wasn't a whole lot of input on team customization, because you only had 4 playable characters, and you didn't have a choice on team composition outside of the VR missions. Now, Rebirth has 7 playable party members, plus you can choose how to craft your team from start to finish. Yeah, some of the dungeons give you a static party, but for the most part, team composition is left up to the player rather than the game deciding for you. Plus, now there's aerial combat, and there are also synergy abilities and skills, and all of this brings so much more depth and makes the combat so much more technical, so much richer and more rewarding, that, like I said, it really puts this up there as one of the best action RPGs out there. Each character plays differently from one another, and they're all so much fun to play with. Cloud is a well-rounded character because on normal mode, on your first playthrough, you are forced to have him in your party the entire time. On hard mode, they remove that shackle and you can make your party consist of whoever you want. You can pull Cloud out if you like. But because he's a forced party member for that first playthrough, he needed to be a jack-of-all-trades character, so he has great aerial combat, ground combat, he's got a Dante-esque stinger attack, he's got great defensive options because he can counter enemies in his heavy attack stance. You need a character like this in a Japanese action RPG because most players are not going to move away from the protagonist. You see this with the Tales of series. Most players stick with the main character from start to finish, and the developers, to make the game more accessible, intentionally make the main character very well-rounded to play and easy to pick up and play, so the game isn't too intimidating for the casual audience. But typically these hero characters are not too demanding to play. They have very low skill ceilings, so if you're looking for more rewarding and engaging gameplay, you're not going to get that from the hero character. You need to look elsewhere. Tifa, on the other hand, has a really great combo-centric playstyle, kind of like what you would see in a character action game. All of her abilities blend together really well, and she's also really great at aerial combat. And you wouldn't think so, but she has a synergy skill which allows her party members to give her a boost into the air, and if you press the dodge button repeatedly, you can hang out in the air practically the entire time. And so with Tifa, she also, if you hold her light attack button, she can bring her little fist down and slam the enemy down to the ground and really maneuver around the battlefield with all of these really great powerful attacks. And she moves so quickly, she's so nimble, and she's also really easy to play. But in spite of that easiness, it just feels so rewarding punching these enemies. She's got really nice hit stun, the hit stun from the stagger. You can feel the impact behind her punches. It's so rewarding to play. But if you're really looking for this kind of technical combo-driven playstyle, Tifa is like the gateway drug to Yuffie. Yuffie is insane. Her kit is just so beautifully well-rounded. It almost feels like I really don't want to play most of the other characters, though they're fun, just because Yuffie brings so much to the table. Her ninjutsu gives her access to 3 elemental affinities on the fly, and it doesn't cost MP, which is important on hard mode, which I'll cover later. But if you combine her ability to strike an enemy's weakness, which deals good stagger damage, with her doppelganger, which lets her attack more frequently, and you take into account that she's really great at attacking from a distance, she is just such an incredibly powerful character that doesn't really need to get up close into the enemies to deal huge damage, but she can if she needs to because she also has a warping gap closer. She just is so nimble the way she moves around the battlefield. She's just completely absurd. It's really easy to stun lock huge groups of enemies with her, and even when you're fighting a boss, you can strike their elemental weaknesses and you can really build up the stagger damage gauge on them as well. Just such a fantastic character, really rewarding to play as her. I really like Yuffie in this game. In terms of combat, my favorite character by far. Red 13 has a pretty cool gauge management system where he can guard and counter enemies to charge it, and then when he enters this vengeance mode form, he can heal off attacks by siphoning HP from enemies. And so he's somewhat of a tank character, but he's also probably one of the faster characters in the game, and he's really great at building up stagger damage. The problem with Red 13 is I don't think he fulfills any niche all that well. As far as tanks go, I think Barret is very definitely the de facto definitive tank of the game. If you want a mage unit, nobody can really beat Aerith, and as far as dealing damage, like nothing comes close to Yuffie, Tifa, and Cloud. Red 13 is a great character and he's a lot of fun to play as, but I don't think he fulfills any particular role very well. He's another one of those jack-of-all-trades characters, but Cloud already has that covered, and I think he covers that better than Red 13 does. Now the rest of the party is not that much fun to play with by comparison. So Barret is a tank, but he's a ranged attacker. Typically with tanks, you would imagine the character is up close in the enemy's face, but Barret is attacking from a range. It doesn't matter too much here, he still fulfills the tank role well. But as far as being an offensive presence on the battlefield, he's not that fun to play as because they're trying to balance out these characters, and his offensive abilities use up multiple ATB gauges at once, so you're not really using a wide variety of abilities to onslaught the enemy like you are with Tifa or Yuffie or even Cloud. He can still do great damage, he can still also build stagger gauge really well, but he does feel a bit one-dimensional and he's not as fun to play with in the player's control. Similar situation with Aerith. She's very slow, her dodge is not that good, and it's very hard to build ATB with her. She's not that rewarding to play because her playstyle is fixated on applying wards and buffs rather than dishing out huge damage. She can apply a ward that doubles up her magic, and her magic stat is very high, but she is more of a support character than anything else. She's best left in the AI's control. Now Cait Sith is a strong character, but he's very weird. I think players that like playing with the summon job in Final Fantasy XIV will probably like playing with Cait Sith here because his Moogle acts independently of him, and he can also mount the Moogle to deal damage to the enemy, but the problem comes from if you want to dodge attacks, Cait Sith will dismount his Moogle. Also, the Moogle can be destroyed by the enemy, and so you then need to resummon it. And without the Moogle on the battlefield, Cait Sith doesn't really deal a whole lot of damage, and his offensive options really are not that great. He's a character that is, a lot of reliance comes from the luck and the randomness of his abilities with throwing dice and his limit break. And so if you like that randomness, there's of course a chance that Cait Sith can be the most powerful party member on the cast, but I think he requires a little bit too much micromanagement to be enjoyable for an action game. Cid and Vincent are not playable. I am not surprised. They are holding them off for part 3, so that way part 3 of this remake trilogy can advertise having new characters to play with. Which kind of sucks because Cid and Vincent were a staple of my team on the original version of Final Fantasy VII, as I imagine the same case is for most people. They're some of the most fun characters of the roster, and that also applies here. I think they're very fun storyline-wise. But in terms of gameplay, we're not really going to see anything out of them until another 4 years passes. I'm interested to see how Square's going to handle Vincent, because if he plays anything like he does in Dirge of Cerberus, that is the absolute worst decision they could make. Alright, so now that I covered how each character controls, I want to go into a little bit more depth on what makes the moment-to-moment combat so satisfying. Cloud's Focus Thrust is a good gap closer, but it also raises stagger buildup, so it's a multi-function move, which means there's more than one practical application. Another good example of what I'm talking about is Yuffie's Blindside. It can be used when you're recovering from an attack, and it does minor area of effect damage, and it can be used in midair. When you give each move multiple functions, you're encouraging free-form combat, and that's something a lot of lesser action games neglect. When you pigeonhole your moves into context-sensitive uses like reaction commands in the Kingdom Hearts series, you're discouraging the player from learning how to make the most of their moveset because the game automates your decisions, so combat feels less rewarding in the long term. Player control in combat should never be reliant on context-sensitive actions. You should have access to your full suite of moves at any given time, and it's up to you to determine when and where to use them. Now, if you're a fan of Kingdom Hearts, you're probably asking why. Why is this a problem? Because learning how to apply your moveset effectively is the entire point of the action game genre. Context-sensitive actions remove that depth and overly simplify combat. So bringing this back to Rebirth with Cloud, generally you don't want to use something like Braver when an enemy isn't staggered because it doesn't cause significant stagger buildup. But there's nothing stopping you from using it. In some situations, you might want to use Braver over something like Focus Thrust, even when an enemy isn't staggered, because Braver can be used in midair, again bringing that multi-functionality into play. With a character like Yuffie, Her ninjutsu can be cast in one of 3 different elements, so you've got 3 moves in one rather than padding out the move list with individual elemental buffs. She also has Doppelganger, which is an amazing maintenance buff that mimics any action, so you can quickly stagger an enemy that's weak to an element by casting the appropriate elemental ninjutsu or magic, and because Doppelganger is a short-lived buff that costs ATB, it by itself doesn't really turn the tide of battle once you cast it, so you need to time when to cast it. That is the important factor to consider when you use that buff. It's such a simple move, and it adds so much depth to her playstyle. But Tifa? Tifa has probably my favorite example of what I'm talking about with multifunctionality. Unbridled Strength is an attack buff that stacks, but it also upgrades her special move each time it's cast. But once you use that special move, the buff is downgraded, and to encourage using that upgraded attack, the buff eventually expires, so you can't just cast the buff twice and forget about it for the rest of the fight. You need to find a good opportunity to use that special attack, and then immediately reapply Unbridled Strength as soon as you can to maintain maximum damage output. And yeah, a lot of these abilities were already in Remake. I already said Remake had a great battle system. Rebirth takes that same battle system and just gives you even more tools to play around with. And for all the flexibility the combat system offers, it would be wasted if the enemy design didn't force you to make the most of your toolkit. Thankfully, the enemy variety is high, with enemies that fly, there are some that burrow underground, some can't even be hit until after they attack, there are some that revive their comrades so you need to kill them in a certain order, and a lot of them have specific conditions that you need to fulfill before you can pressure them. That means you can't just hit an enemy with the element they're weak to and call it a day. The game wants you to pay attention to the enemy's behaviors before reacting, just like you did in those ATB-era Final Fantasy games. I am shocked that Square Enix put in this much effort into the combat system. It is a massive refinement over Remake, and it has almost everything I'm looking for in an action game. Now, as fun as the characters are to play, I think that the character growth could have been handled a bit better. I don't know what Square's fixation is on sphere grids. Ever since Final Fantasy X, they've been obsessed with having a grid sort of progression system for leveling up. I think it was executed pretty well in Final Fantasy XII with the license board, though that did have issues, and it wound up being somewhat addressed with the Zodiac Age and International Zodiac Job System versions. But with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, this skill tree is very simplistic, and it mostly confers passive benefits, which are really not that interesting. You do get abilities, but they are character specific, so if you don't like using a specific character, you're really not going to want to grab like the Tifa and Cait Sith ability combo. Now, the materia system is pretty fun. It's a very flexible system. It allows for a lot of variety between the builds, but you can't easily swap materia wholesale. You can only swap them one at a time. You can see the entire party's collective equipped materia at once, and you can easily move around individual materia, but because you can save like party loadouts, so for example, I can save 3 preset teams. I can have like Cloud, Barret, Tifa, Yuffie, Cait Sith, Red 13, and I can swap between those 3 teams at will. Why can't there be presets or loadouts for materia as well? Why can't I have one that's fixated on absorbing like fire damage? Why can't I have one that's fixated on passive benefits? Having the ability to save loadouts for materia would be very helpful here, because once you get to the end game and each character can equip like 14 or 15 materia at once, it becomes very clunky sorting through this materia that's equipped and reading every single one and determining what to move and where. And so you spend a lot more time in this menu than you really should. Now, the item crafting system sucks. It sucks in almost every single one of these kind of games. Rebirth isn't really an open world game. It's a linear game with open environments that you can explore a little bit or a lot. Xenoblade is very similar, but typically these games have item crafting to give you an incentive to explore the world and pick up all the junk that's littered around the floor. That is unnecessary. You already have an incentive to explore this world. There are open world activities like climbing towers, engaging in side quests, doing these minigames. You don't need to collect garbage from the floor to craft consumables. Consumables, by the way, which you don't need, you can buy them from shops. They're dirt cheap. You can find them from chests in the wild. And on hard mode, you can't even use consumables. You can also craft equipment and accessories, but generally speaking, they're not better than what you would just find from exploring in the wild and buying from shops. So what's my incentive for leveling up my item transmutation level so I can craft the next tier of accessory or of equipment when I'm already finding better stuff 30 minutes or an hour later from a shop anyway? Most of the time, when I unlock the next tier of equipment, it's not better than what I already have. So this system is completely pointless. You can completely ignore the item transmutation and miss nothing. So I'm not going to dock the game and say it's worse by having it, but it is a completely pointless addition. Speaking of hard mode, there was a hard mode in Remake as well, but the hard mode in Rebirth is a fair bit harder than that, and it's actually like a whole brand new game. So when you play Rebirth, your first playthrough, you're going to do all the minigames, you're going to do all this exploring, you're going to spend the time doing all the RPG stuff that people like from this genre. On hard mode, you've got the character action goodness. You're locked in at level 70, you're not going to get stronger, the enemies are going to kick your ass, and you need to learn the specific way to beat them. You need to have the right materia set up, you need to have the right party composition, and the game will destroy you until you learn how to fight these bosses. On normal mode, for example, the Midgar, he is very simple to fight. He's a complete pushover. You will never see him fire off his ultimate attack beta because you just deal so much damage so fast. It's not even really a proper boss fight. And it's a shame because in the original Final Fantasy VII, the Midgar kicked your ass. You were supposed to avoid him. On hard mode, they bring back that ass kicking, not just with him, but with most bosses. Because if you do not know the right materia setup going into the fight, you are going to get your ass handed to you over and again until you learn how to fight the boss properly. You finally will learn the intricacies of the combat system, you'll learn how to dodge the enemy patterns. It's so rewarding, it feels like a brand new game. This is the kind of challenge that I was looking for from this series, from games like Final Fantasy XVI, and I wasn't getting it. And the small changes that are incorporated to make this hard mode fun, it's really simple. Like, you can't use items, so you can't use items, and you can't regenerate MP from benches outside of the Chocobo stands, and also between chapters there are parts where the game will replenish your HP and MP for you. So you cannot just wildly go reckless with abandon with casting healing and raise spells, but on the skill tree there are magic abilities on normal mode that you will never use that make MP cost 0, or they're like 0 MP cost spells. There are also some synergy abilities that make you have infinite MP for a while. You will use these on hard mode. And so things like that where you're like, this doesn't really seem to make much sense, I'm not getting much use out of it on normal mode. All of a sudden on hard mode, you need to use your full kit, and look at what options have been waiting there the whole time for you to use. So this is a really well-designed combat system. I'm really shocked that something like this came out of Square Enix. I was never expecting there to be a game that was this well-balanced, but on hard mode, this game is so engaging. It really is remarkable how much fun this game is. Normal mode is plenty fun. It has a pretty good challenge in and of itself, but hard mode, man, you can just ignore the minigames, focus on combat, and have a really good time with this one. Now, I think a lot of people will agree that the combat in this game is good, but something that I've seen that has been pretty contentious are the amount of minigames in this game, and they're very inconsistent in terms of quality. I happen to really like minigames, and I think for the most part the minigames in this game are well done. I think they are designed well, but the one that I think most people are going to praise is going to be Queen's Blood, just because it has a very prominent role, but it is too easy. And it suffers from the same issue that Triple Triad does in that respect, in that it's very easy to get overpowered cards and completely break this entire system. Except Queen's Blood is even more imbalanced than Triple Triad because you always go first and you always start on the left-hand side. And because you always start first, that encourages an aggro playstyle. So what I did in this game from the very first match is I quickly realized that aggro was the way to go, so I packed my deck on the lower end with all the cheap 1-pawn cost skill cards, and I just played very aggressively and tried to get board dominance to lock the opponent out from being able to play cards. And for the first half of the game, there's no challenge. You just completely steamroll every opponent. In the second half, the opponents start incorporating cards where they can replace their pre-existing cards, and that in turn lets them acquire more spaces on the board. And that does make it a little more challenging, and by that I mean it doesn't make it more challenging at all, because you still go first, you still play super hyper aggressive the entire time, and you will win every single time with very little effort. There's not a whole lot of variety in Queen's Blood outside of the little minigame challenges in the Golden Saucer, which are cool, but there needs to be more of these. So in the Golden Saucer, sometimes they'll make you start on the right-hand side. There's some sort of board obstacle that affects either the opponent or yourself. There are cool little challenges like that. That should have been stuff that should have been part of the entirety of Queen's Blood throughout the entire campaign. Queen's Blood has its own little self-contained storyline where you fight 30 opponents, and they all are extremely easy to fight. There's no stakes. There's no ante, you don't bet cards, you don't bet gil. There are like a handful of matches that are played for a joke amount of gil, like 2 or 3, it doesn't even really matter. The only time it gets challenging at all is for the final match, where the AI cheats, where she can play the highest cost cards right away wherever she wants. Queen's Blood, it's fun, but I really didn't have an incentive to try out different decks, different strategies. Overwhelming majority of these cards are cards that destroy other cards, either your own or the enemy, or they debuff enemy cards, or they replace your existing cards. I didn't use these at all. I never felt an incentive to use them. I never felt an incentive to vary my strategy. And because you always start on the left-hand side, you don't need to incorporate cards that acquire parts of the board to your left. You always want to get cards that acquire parts of the board to the right. Again, if this system, if there was a coin flip at the start of every match to determine who went first and on which side of the board you started on, then you would have to create a more well-rounded deck, or you would have to create more deck archetypes to be able to compete. If the AI was a little better, then maybe then I would have an incentive to use cards that weaken theirs or destroy theirs. But the AI isn't good, the challenge isn't there. I really didn't have an incentive to play anything other than the most hyper-aggressive playstyle, and I didn't really modify my deck at all. I played the same way from start to finish. So it's a fun distraction. I just don't think that there's a whole lot of depth here, despite there being a ton of cards to collect. You really don't have an incentive to use probably 90% of them. Chocobo Racing is Diet Mario Kart. I like the variety of tracks. There's a good amount of tracks here. I like the customization options with the different outfits you can get for your Chocobos, and it affects their stats and the abilities they have. Problem, none of that matters. Just build for speed and acceleration on your fastest Chocobo, and you will win every single race, first try, no difficulty whatsoever. It's too easy. In the game, later on, you get a Chocobo that can jump, and so the only challenge from these Chocobo races are these Cactuar gates that open and close on a cycle, and you can wind up crashing into them. But if you have the ability to jump over this obstacle, then there's even less challenge. So there's really no depth here. It's fun. I like the way the Chocobos control. I like the way the maps look. But again, kind of like Queen's Blood, they did a poor job balancing this. There's a good variety, but there's no incentive to use all of these features because the difficulty is tuned way too low. Fort Condor. Again, too easy, too shallow. You can't even make a team for Fort Condor. You have presets that you swap between, and it's the same board every single time. The only difference is that the enemy spawn types and the frequency changes. And this mode doesn't really favor defensive play, only offense. You want to whittle down the enemy forces as soon as possible because you are on a time limit. You can't afford to play defensively. You need to play offensively. I know it's tower defense and not really a true strategy game, but I really don't like the rock, paper, scissors mechanic. It feels too simple. This is a minigame that really needed a lot more fleshing out. This feels more like a concept for a minigame rather than something that you would want to play. There's like a hard mode that you unlock, but it's barely any more difficult. There's one strategy that you will use every single time because the mechanics are very simple. You are very limited in the loadouts that you can choose. The game is balanced to use these specific loadouts, so I really don't understand what the point is of this Fort Condor minigame outside, like it's part of the Proto Relic quest, so you need to do this 4 times, and by the time you do it the second time, you've already seen everything there is to see here. What needed to happen with Fort Condor was there needed to be different boards. Instead of just having 2 lanes, you needed to have ones that had an additional lane, like maybe a middle lane, or you can maybe flank the enemy from the side. You needed better stage variety. You also needed better unit variety. There are flying units, but because of the rock, paper, scissors mechanic, you just match up the color against a weakness to kill the enemy. Having maybe different affinity types like slash beats blunt, beats piercing, throwing in a second type of rock, paper, scissors mechanic layered on top of the first would give you more options, more variety, give me more unit types, allow me to create more teams. Maybe I want to make a team filled with nothing but red offensive units. Maybe instead of just having me use Barret, Tifa, and Cloud as my primary attacking force, let me use all of the other party members. Maybe give them other abilities as well. Instead of just focusing on one boss, maybe have 2 bosses to fight. Maybe, instead of just having me focus on offense, maybe have me hold out on defense. Use the time limit and say, hey, you have 5 minutes you need to withstand this never-ending force of enemy forces and let them not reach your base. You could have done so much more with this, and they went the really simplistic road of just bum rush the enemy in 3 minutes to kill their leader. There's not a whole lot to this one. Now, Gears and Gambits takes Fort Condor and puts it in a circle, but it has Final Fantasy XII Gambit system, so it's awesome. So I am heavily biased here because I love the Gambit system in Final Fantasy XII, and you can create the AI for your units in this minigame. So immediately, it pushes it leagues above Fort Condor. It still uses the same rock, paper, scissors mechanic as Fort Condor. It still has just one map. You're still just fighting the same enemies in every single one of these missions. There's no variety. It's very easy. But being able to program the AI for your units is so addicting. It's so fun. This should have been fleshed out so much more. They are sitting on a gold mine here. This, I think if they threw out Chocobo Racing and Fort Condor and probably about 50% of the remaining minigames, and they used that time to flesh out Gears and Gambits and give it the attention that they gave Queen's Blood, would have been really special, because I think this has the potential to be the best minigame, and they didn't really do much with it. But what is here is still plenty fun. Now that about wraps up the more in-depth minigames, but there are about 24 or so smaller ones sprinkled throughout the game. Some of the story ones are pretty weak. There's a dolphin balloon race where all you do is just race and collect balloons. I don't even think there's a harder one. It's just get to the ending of this track in time so you can complete it, which I did on my first try. There's a Junon military march, which is a very simple rhythm minigame where the camera tries its best to completely screw you over. There's a Mount Corel roller coaster, which is pretty cool, but again, I don't even think there's any replay value here, so it's like a one and done thing. There is a cool shootout with Barret shooting from the back of the buggy. He's trying to shoot down Palmer, who's chasing after them. That's pretty fun, but again, one and done. A lot of these story ones, there's not a harder... there might be a harder one. I'm not sure. I didn't double check, but it kind of seems like you just do them once, and they're fun for a little distraction, but there's not a whole lot to them. They're not anything that's supposed to be addicting. Like, let me go back and try it on a harder difficulty. You're not supposed to take these too seriously. Now, the rest range from pretty bad to absolutely awful. There's a frog jump one that is so incredibly annoying because there's movement inertia, so you need to sprint the entire time in order to make these jumps, and so towards the end, the platform is very small, and you need to just constantly be sprinting in a circle to try to dodge this spinning, rotating obstacle before it kills you. It's extremely annoying. It took like 10 minutes to try to beat this one. Just because the movement inertia. If you could turn on a dime, there would be no challenge to this whatsoever. You could be doing this for 50 minutes without any issue. But because there's a wind up, you have to be moving the entire time. And the camera is zoomed in very close, so it's very difficult to gauge where you are in relation to where the obstacle is, especially when it starts speeding up towards the end. There's a shooting gallery one. Trying to play any sort of first-person shooter with an analog stick on a controller is not my idea of a good time. This is okay, but kind of similar to the Resident Evil 4 minigame. It's not anything that I really find that engaging. There's a Red 13 soccer minigame. Again, AI. So laughably terrible. I don't even think you could lose this one if you tried. There's a piano rhythm minigame one, which is actually pretty challenging because the analog sticks are too imprecise for a rhythm game. Most rhythm games use space buttons. They do not use analog sticks because these are not meant for precise movement. And so when you try to play this piano, you move this stick, you have 360 range degree of movement. And so if you had something like an octo gate on an arcade stick, it would probably be better because you could just ride the gate into the directions and you would get exactly what you wanted. But because you have a free range of movement, typically what you're going to do is you're going to wind up playing a note that you didn't want to play, and the game will audibly play that note and it will throw you off, and then that spirals out of control and you wind up missing several notes because the analog sticks are too imprecise for a rhythm game. There's a Tifa sit-up minigame. All I'm going to say is thank God there are only 4 of these. This is not really that fun to do. I don't like how the inputs disappear, especially when it starts moving along really fast, and once you make one mistake in the last match, you basically screw yourself over. So you need to play perfectly for about a minute and a half for this last sit-up minigame match. And thank God once it's done, it's done. You don't need to worry about it anyway. This is like bottom of the barrel minigame tier we're scratching right here. Now, there's a space shooting minigame, and this one was very disappointing because I love shmups, I love spaceship shooters, I love rail shooters. This is not that good. In fact, this is pretty bad. The scoring is very simplistic, the challenge is completely non-existent here, and I don't really like the way the ship controls. It's a kind of a rail shooter setup, but I think it's zoomed in a little bit too close. There's no fun enemy patterns to dodge in terms of their attacks, like their bullets. I don't think there's a good variety of enemy ships to fight. I don't think the bosses are that fun to fight. I don't think that the level is that fun to navigate. There's only one level. There is a hard mode that you unlock at the end of the game, towards the end of the game, like chapter 12, when you revisit the gold saucer. But it's just so disappointing. And I know this is trying to copy the absolutely horrible spaceship shooting minigame from the original version of Final Fantasy VII, but you know, Square has a good team when it comes to creating shooters. They made Einhander in the 90s on the PS1. That is a phenomenal shmup, and I'm pretty sure a lot of the staff that worked on that game not only worked on Final Fantasy VII as well, the original, I believe they are still working at Square Enix. So I'm not sure if they played a hand in creating this space shooting minigame. I think a better option would be to just copy and paste the ROM for Einhander, and I would have been so immensely satisfied. Would have been way better than whatever the hell this thing is that they pushed out. There's a Punch-Out clone, which was surprisingly fun, but it doesn't have enough opponents. It gets challenging towards the end, which is really cool because you need to rely on trial and error to beat these enemies. You're not going to beat them on your first try, which is a good thing. That's how it should be. You need to get better. You should see yourself improving. Most of these minigames are very one-note, flat, one-dimensional. You're going to play them once, you're going to get the high score and beat them on your first try, and you will never revisit them. And there's so many of these minigames, they're not all winners, like Mario Party. Not all of them are going to be great, but at least here, there's the benefit of this being an action game. You didn't need to have this loaded with minigames. You could have cut the minigame amount in half and used that time and those resources to flesh out stuff like this Punch-Out clone. You could have doubled the number of opponents, and it would be a lot better. G-Bike is just a copy-paste job from the ending sequence in Remake. Very simple, not a whole lot to say. There's a box breaking within a time limit minigame, and I actually kind of like this one. You have to get a high score in time by breaking these boxes, and there's some electric ones that you need to break to power up bigger boxes that you can break to progress through the stage. Again, one stage, there needs to be more stages. Later on in the game you unlock a harder version, but there needs to be more variety. Give me this minigame, but instead of just forcing me to play with Cloud, let me play as the other party members. Let me play as Barret. Let me do this with Red 13. Give me more stages to do this in. This is really cool. It's very simple too. I really liked it, but there's just one of them in the game. There's one where you need to lure chickens with a box, and it is something straight out of a nightmare. I can't believe this was put in the game. Thankfully, this is a side quest. This is not a compulsory main story minigame. Thank God, because this is absolutely one of the worst minigames I think I've ever seen. In fact, they tease you towards the end. Once you spend like 5 minutes luring chickens with this box, and then the old lady sends you out into the jungle to get a chicken that's like a mile away. And once you get to the chicken, the game fakes you out and actually has you believe for a second that you're gonna lure this damn chicken all the way back to town before a monster finally attacks, and you're like, okay, thank God, because I could not fathom actually having to lure this damn chicken for about 20 minutes back to town. This minigame sucks. There's a mushroom picking one, and it's a complete nothing minigame. All you do is you maneuver the mushroom cap around, find the part that has the most give, and then work your way backwards to the one that has the most amount of resistance. It's just part of a side quest. Again, it's optional. These Gungaga minigames are all equally terrible. This is nothing. This is just a waste of time. Now, the Chocobo flying minigame is horrible, horrible, horrible. The camera is super inflamed nutsack. Why the hell are both sticks mapped to adjusting altitude? Why can't one of the sticks control the camera? Why is it zoomed in so damn close? There's a minimum threshold for flying up after you pull yourself down for a drop, but it's not clear what that threshold is. You have to guess how far you have to drop before you can finally flick the stick up and try to gain momentum upward. Because it's not obvious, a lot of the time you will just crash into the ground and immediately end the minigame. And if you miss just one ring, you will not get the high score. You need to start all over. This minigame is so absolutely infuriating because the controls are terrible. It's difficult to get the rings to register you passing through them sometimes, because if you clip them from the edge, the game won't count it. It's inconsistent. So everything about this minigame is just terrible. There's no reason for it to be like, I thought you would think that this flying through rings minigame garbage would have been complete video game poison with the failure of Superman 64, 25, almost 30 years ago. You would hope that no one would ever dare to put this type of minigame in their games again. You used to see a lot of this in the PS1 and PS2 era in games like Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter, like flying through rings, that kind of stuff. I hated these minigames then. I hate it here. I hate it here more than ever because the controls are terrible. Why does it need to be zoomed in so close? Typically, when the camera is zoomed in up the Chocobo's ass, you can't see where the upcoming rings are, so you just need to guess. And because they're moving around, oftentimes you're gonna miss them. And so you need to restart and do it over and over and over and over and over. You don't need to do this. Again, this is a side quest. It's completely optional. Thank God for that, because this minigame, just the controls alone completely kill it. Like, This is one, next to maybe the frog jump minigame, I have no desire to ever revisit this, because it controls like crap, plain and simple. You know, I can forgive a minigame not being fleshed out, not being well conceived, being boring, being lame, having no replay value. This just controls so bad that I never want to see it again. Moving on to exploration. The game is not open world. Not really. It has linear progression through huge open areas, kind of like Xenoblade. You have these big chunks of level that feel open world-esque, but the whole map itself is not a giant playground that you can just go to in any random order. There's a structure here, which means the game is pretty well balanced throughout the whole experience. Now, because the levels are much larger than Remake's linear corridors, there needed to be changes to movement. There's no jump button, but you do vault over terrain. It's kind of finicky, but for the most part it works well. You don't need to follow strict paths to get around these environments. You can hop over ledges and climb short, like knee-high walls. You can hop over fences. It's a little slow when you first get to an area until you unlock the Chocobo. And riding the Chocobo, you know, that's fun and all, but typically to unlock the Chocobo for a region, you need to do this stealth minigame to get them, and it's very slow, it's very simple, the stealth mechanics really aren't that great. It feels like padding, you really didn't need this, and once you reach the second half of the Corel region, you're automatically given the buggy, but the buggy is not nearly as fun to control as the Chocobo. It takes a lot longer to spawn, it takes a lot longer to enter and exit the vehicle, it's not as easily maneuverable. The Chocobo can drift, which is a lot of fun. Thankfully, there's only one region where you're forced to use the buggy. For the rest, you can use the Chocobos, and they are much more entertaining to use to get around. There's also some sections where you need to climb to get to a higher elevation or to cross a gap, and of course, yellow paint makes a notorious comeback here. Zelda spoiled me when it comes to climbing in video games. Like, just let me climb everything in the environment. Why do I need to go to these specific yellow painted spots to go up or down? And because these are much larger environments, they are packed with different activities to incentivize you to explore them. So some of these are like the Proto Relic quests, which are fun. They have unique mechanics or fun storylines. These are where you find Gears and Gambits and Fort Condor. There are these towers that take no effort to climb that reveal the different points on the map. Of course, this is ubiquitous in this genre at this point. There are these shrines dedicated to the summons where you have to play this very simple memory minigame. There are these little materia deposits where you have to play the exact same timing minigame where you just press triangle. There are spots where you dig up buried treasure with the Chocobo. It's just very simple stuff. The Moogle houses where you play... Oh my god, did I even talk about the Moogle minigame? Holy shit, the Moogle minigame.
Kupo.
And I hate the way they look. They have like these... They have teeth. Who thought it was a good idea to give Moogles teeth? What the fuck? The design is just... The redesign is so hideous. I can't stand looking at them. Man. Anyway, I like the lore that opens up as you complete these activities. Golden Saucer's Mako reactors are responsible for the desertification of the Corel region. I'm not sure if this was explained in the original version of Final Fantasy VII, but it's nice to get a little bit more backstory for the way this world is. So I think I covered everything I wanted to touch upon in regards to the gameplay of this game. Like I said, I enjoy most of it, even though I have a lot of little nitpicks. For the most part, the combat system itself is great, the minigame variety is very high, even though they're inconsistent for a first-time playthrough. They're really fun, and then when you play on hard mode, you can skip the minigames and side quests and just enjoy everything the combat has to offer. So I think in terms of gameplay, Rebirth is top-notch. In terms of the main story, I mean, I really don't have that much to say because it's pretty much the same as Remake. You took the original game, and all of the beats that follow the story of the original game are still entertaining, but all the new stuff, it's not questionable. I guess it is questionable. Why did you do this? So, I think overall, the story in Rebirth is maybe a little bit better than Remake because the ghosts don't show up until past the halfway point. But the difference with Rebirth, and why I think it's a little better, is that the character development is really good here.
Just turned 4. She's in Midgar.
I think the star of the show, really, is Barret. Barret is such an awesome character. He has such an entertaining arc. I love his English voice acting.
What in the hell was that? Hey guys, it's me. Who?
His scene with Dyne, I'm not going to show the whole thing here, but it's like the highlight of the game. It's a genuinely fantastic little story arc that's wrapped up nicely. The whole thing is just fantastic. Although I don't know why Dyne turned into a Resident Evil 8 villain. That really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but whatever, the fight is still fun. Gus, aka the artist formerly known as Coates, has a fun little section. I like his theme song. The new music is really good. There's a lot of variety, lots of catchy vocal tracks that get stuck in your head. Gus's theme, the frog jump one, the minigame sucks, but the song is catchy. Every time you chase a dog, it plays a little song. The space minigame has probably like my favorite song in the entire soundtrack. The remixed music is generally good, but I think I still prefer Uematsu's original tracks. They're more memorable. Red 13 has a voice change partway through the game. This is something that I think it was a translation issue with the original version of the game. The translators didn't really convey how Red 13's manner of speaking changes once he reaches Cosmo Canyon. So this is another one of those things that's lost in translation, and it really highlights how the original script for this game really wasn't that great. The voice acting really helps make this a much more memorable character.
Hey, guys! It's me! I'm back!
I love a lot of the little goofy moments in the game. The entire Golden Saucer arc is just pure gold. Tifa and Aerith, you really feel like they have a genuine friendship in this game. Every time they have a scene together, it just feels fun seeing them interact with one another. The Loveless play at the end of the game, when you have the date with your character, it's basically like watching a Broadway show. It's a lot of fun. It has a little rhythm minigame to go along with it, and that's whatever, but it's such a fun scene. It's a nice little reprieve. It's the calm before the storm, the last 8-hour gauntlet that you have to get through to finish this game. They give you this fun little treat to prep you for that. So I have a lot of positive things to say in regards to character development, but the main plot itself it's terrible, and most of the game revolves around chasing these black robes. And I have no idea where they are even getting these robes, who is mass producing these, and why are they dressing people up in black robes when they're ready to be converted into a Sephiroth clone. It just doesn't really make any sense. And maybe I'm missing something here, but I played the original Final Fantasy VII, played Dirge of Cerberus, Crisis Core, Remake, I watched Advent Children, and I played 2 matches of First Soldier before it was shut offline like 3 days after it came out. And I still have no clue who the hell Glenn is. Where did this character come from? The Turks, you run into the Turks constantly in this game, and they're very incompetent. You whoop their ass every time, and you just let them go. Like, why? Why doesn't Barret just shoot these guys with this gun arm and kill them? Like, why do you keep letting these guys get away? But the biggest problem with this game, by far, is that for all this effort to treat this remake trilogy as something easy for newcomers to play, it relies on you playing the original game. If you didn't play the original, you're not gonna have any clue what the hell is going on with Zack or the ending. Well, like, these Zack sequences make no sense. It's an alternate universe where the party members are either dead or they're like in comas, and Zack somehow survived, and he has like little branching paths he needs to determine which to take to save people. It just, what is the point of this? Please, leave Zack dead. Why do you need to have him reunite with Cloud in a merged timeline? This is just, Nojima has an enormous issue when it comes to writing twists. Seriously, he does. Stop trying to make things overly complicated. Keep it simple. You had it right the first time. I know you so desperately want to tack on extra crap to try to make it more convoluted. It's not necessary. You already had it right the first time. Don't fix what isn't broken. By making the story more convoluted, you're not making it more interesting. The reason why Aerith's death was so effective in the original game was because it was played very straightforward and serious. There was no ambiguity. In Rebirth, Aerith is both dead and alive? What are you doing? Pick a lane and stick to it. You're not making anyone happy by having her be both dead and alive. You need to commit. So, that's all I'm going to say in regards to the story, because I don't want to spend 3 hours criticizing every single little point, because like I said, it doesn't matter. I don't think the story is well written. I think the characters are fun. I think some of the side quests have their own fun little self-contained story arcs, but the narrative? Throw it out. So when part 3 comes out, I really don't care how this is going to be wrapped up. I'm not in it for the story. I'm in it for the fantastic gameplay. You keep improving on this gameplay, and I'm there. The story? At this point, do whatever you want with it. It doesn't matter to me. It's completely smeared into the asphalt and unrecognizable at this point. So overall, I really had a great time with Rebirth. I know you may think it's silly to say that when I just bashed the story and called it horrible, but in the grand scheme of things, I still had fun with a lot of the story. I had fun with these characters, and of course the combat was enjoyable from start to finish. I wouldn't have sunk 75 hours into this game if I wasn't having a good time. I would have dropped it. Seriously. I didn't go into this game wanting to hate it, and I walked away really satisfied. I really didn't know if I was gonna be able to finish this game, and I walked away playing hard mode. I'm like, this is a great experience. Genuinely. It took 18 years for Square Enix to finally wake up and get out of their slump that they were in. Keep it up with the combat. And for the love of God, hire a competent scenario writer. You don't need to outsource to this guy anymore. You really don't. And while you're at it, please do the world a favor, Square. Put your games on PC from day one. Enough with this Times Sony exclusivity nonsense. The PlayStation 5 is such a joke. I had to charge my controller every hour and a half because Sony's PS5 controllers are the worst controllers I've ever owned. But when this game inevitably comes out on PC, I'm probably going to double dip and get it again just so I can play with mods and play it with proper frame rate and not all the issues that come with this worthless console. But you did a good job, Square. It only took 18 years, so hopefully this is a sign of better things to come.